our next guest on the line, his name is Kevin Ring. He's president of an organization called Families Against Mandatory Minimums, and it's in a very important cause here in Pennsylvania, especially with what we're getting ready to talk about. How you doing, Kevin? Welcome to the program.
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for taking the time out to talk about this evening, and as well on short notice. We appreciate that as well. Read a story today that certainly I found interesting. There's a Pennsylvania state representative. His name is Todd Stevens. He wants to introduce a bill here in Pennsylvania to bring back mandatory minimum sentences. House Bill 741, I believe it's been labeled thus far, that would sort of introduce that right back into our legal system, something that a Supreme Court vote, I believe, of 3-2 knocked out a couple of years ago. They eliminated sort of this mandatory minimum sentence provision, that that prosecutors would sometimes adhere to over the years. But in 2015, as we said, that sort of got moved out. But this state representative wants to kind of bring that back, and his arguments don't seem to be all that strong. Now, I just wanted to, from your perspective and from your research and work into this, I mean, what has been some of the reasons why you feel, or maybe some other folks who have done research into this kind of feel like mandatory minimums aren't a good idea?
Well, they're really just frankly, there's a dumb idea. It's a dumb approach to solving crime. Usually when our justice system works, what you want is punishment that fits the crime. That's sort of a common phrase you hear.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody does a crime, you want the punishment to fit. And usually that means you want to be proportionate. If somebody commits a serious offense, you want a more serious penalty. If it's a lesser crime, you want maybe a more modest punishment. Either way, you want to have precision. You want to be proportionate to what they did. A mandatory minimum is just the exact opposite of that. It's a one-size-fits-all sentence that you apply to people who commit a certain offense. And so, say a drug conspiracy, you could have the kingpin who has 10, street corner dealers all over their city, and when one of those guys gets picked up, he or she will be held accountable for all the drugs that everybody sold because they're involved in the same conspiracy. And so instead of looking at somebody's role in the offense, for instance,
mm-hmm.
you just hold them equally liable, and they all get the same stupid sentence. And it's not an efficient way to run anything, let alone a criminal justice system.
Now, these became, kind of popular in the 80s and 90s when there was this sort of, I don't want to call it a crime wave because that's a bad way to characterize it, more like the hysteria over a particular crime wave. I think oftentimes kind of push legislators into enforcing these policies that certainly strongly encouraged or even recommended mandatory minimum sentences during the 80s and 90s as well.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Crime did rise in the 70s and in the 80s, and lawmakers were worried, and the public was worried, and so, when there was hysteria or well-founded concerns, there was a rise in violent crime in this country, and so politicians were looking to do anything to show that they were going to get tough on it. So well-intentioned or not, they were trying to be responsive to public concerns. If you look at public opinion polls at the time, crime was always one of the top issues.
Mm-hmm.
What's so strange about this effort is we're at a historical low for crime right now. At least two generations this is the lowest crime level. Pennsylvania in particular has done very well. You don't ever want to be complacent, but Pennsylvania's crime rate is low, both violent crime, property crime, and so the idea that there's some justification for bringing these back, I just don't see it. That was the argument. You were right. 20 years ago or 30 years ago,
yeah.
That's why they passed them. So right now, this is a solution in search of a question, or an answer in search of a solution. It just makes no sense at all.
Right. And we're speaking with Kevin Ring. He's president of Families Against Mandatory Minimums here. And we're talking about State Rep Todd Stevens, who's introducing this bill, House Bill 741, that would effectively do just that. And what he says of this is kind of reissuing some of the reasons in the 80s and 90s that were kind of brought up as for reasons why we wanted to introduce mandatory minimums in the first place, that it would deter folks from crime. ultimately, those sort of unfair punishments that you just described earlier, like a low man on the totem pole, so to speak, could catch just as much flack, as the high man on the totem pole on accountability for these drugs. And maybe that would scare people from being involved in what could be called the conspiracy to sell drugs or the conspiracy to distribute or anything else like that. But that didn't really happen, did it?
No, I mean, if there's an award for the world's dumbest argument for mandatory minimums, it's deterrence, because drug dealers are not people who sit there and pore through the Pennsylvania criminal code
right.
and sort of to understand exactly what the penalties are for their crime. I mean, it just makes no sense. And the Pennsylvania Sentencing Commission years ago did a study of the state's mandatory sentencing laws. They did a public opinion poll, and only 1 in 3 Pennsylvanians even could name a crime that carried a mandatory minimum. So how can you be deterred from something you don't even know about? So the whole idea makes no sense. These aren't long-term thinkers. If they were, they wouldn't be selling drugs in the first place. So, I mean, it just makes no sense. It's just based on this complete lie that these people are just rational actors who are weighing costs and benefits. It just doesn't make any sense.
Kind of like that, the idea that in the 80s that drug prevention could be, best executed by just saying no, right? Like if you just, I mean, this kind of sets the wrong approach about how they want to solve the drug problem,
right.
As well, right?
Well, that's right. I mean, so, the reaction for mandatory minimums in the 80s and 90s, as you know, was crack cocaine. And there was at least, arguably, there was an overreaction, but there was at least violence that came with it, that rose with crack, that people were genuinely scared about. We are in the throes of a heroin and opiate crisis right now, and no one thinks that's anything but an addiction issue. I mean, we're just 30 years smarter down the road from where we were in the 80s and 90s, and we realize what these people need is treatment and help, and the idea of locking up a bunch of addicts. And people confuse this. They say, well, no, I don't want to hurt the addict. I want to help the seller. Well, a lot of these people are selling drugs in order to do drugs. They're feeding their own habits. So there's not a very clear line between trafficker and, addict.
And user, yeah.
Yeah, and so it's just we're going backwards, it seems, in our understanding. And again, I think it's because people are scared. The overdose numbers are scary. People want a solution, and so politicians, want to look busy and look like they're responding to a crisis.
And I think this is definitely the wrong direction to go in this. And I'm kind of connecting it to some other things that I've seen in government. And reading this story today totally reminded me of an early executive order or executive action, I think, that was taken by the Trump administration that effectively kind of reopened the conversation that that the federal government will have with private prisons and striking deals with private prisons. And this was sort of the same type of things. Like, this is a policy that simply doesn't work, right? Like, private prisons had more issues with safety and security and all that other stuff. And kind of moving away from this idea that locking up more folks is the right treatment for this kind of thing. And it in my opinion, at least, it kind of shows that this entire administration and really folks on both sides of the aisle are having a tough time trying to figure out what to do on drugs. It doesn't seem like anyone has really a good policy from a federal perspective.
I think that's right. I think there's a problem on both sides. I think this is a problem for politicians. What's strange is, during the last presidential campaign, you had a lot of candidates on both sides of the aisle. Chris Christie, Carly Fiorina on the Republican side, Jeb Bush, all of whom had, family members who were affected by drug abuse and addiction, speaking eloquently about the answer being treatment and getting these people out of our criminal justice system. And so things, I thought, had improved, and it's just in the last year or so. And I think certainly President Trump has talked about addiction and taking care of that, but the Attorney General seems prepared to relaunch the war on drugs.
Yeah.
And private prisons or public prisons, whatever you're going to do, the budget that just got submitted was talking about cutting $1 billion from prison construction. And yet that's based on the fact that we finally reduced the federal prison population, and he looks like he's ready to fill it back up. So I don't know how they're going to make all this work.
Yeah, not a whole lot of budgetary line items that are making a whole lot of sense right now. There was something on the other side of this, and I wanted to know what you thought about this because I thought it was strange. Well, not strange. I didn't think it was strange. I thought it kind of made sense, but I thought it was intriguing that the reason behind the bipartisan support behind this, we were just talking about this the other day, how reducing recidivism and reforming the criminal justice system is one of the rare items that both sides of the aisle can agree on that needs to change, at least at this particular time in politics. And the reason I think that everyone can come to agree on isn't that these folks need better treatment or that it's unfairly affecting African Americans. Like there's of course this Georgetown study that found that mandatory minimums disproportionately affected African American males, and the ACLU sort of backed that up as well by saying their African Americans are 4 to 5 times more likely to be convicted for drug possession, even though whites use drugs at a higher rate, right? These are things that we know now because of this that greatly affect our social construction and how we grow as a society. Yet everyone seems to settle on the concept whenever it comes to criminal justice reform that costs are the reason why we need to make these moves and not treatment. Isn't that kind of problematic whenever we're trying to squash this whole problem as a whole?
Well, I think people have a million different motives for why they support reform or why they're opposed to reform. I think there's people out there, there's social conservatives, Christian conservatives who believe that people deserve a second chance. I think there's fiscal conservatives who think, the prison system is too expensive and it's a failed big government program, and so it's consistent with their philosophy. I think there's people on the left who think that racial justice is a reason why, and the disparate, sort of population in the prisons and the impact it's had in the African American community is the reason. I think people have all sorts of reasons for supporting or opposing reform, and I think whatever gets you there is, people have different priorities. I think what's interesting is that people who disagree on a bunch of other issues have come together on this issue. In Pennsylvania, that's absolutely the case. You have the Conservative Commonwealth Foundation working with the ACLU of Pennsylvania, both in support of eliminating mandatory minimum sentences. That's a good thing. How they got there, concerns me less.
Yeah, I think you are absolutely right when it comes to politics. So long as it gets done. The only thing I guess I'm concerned about is if the sentiment is all about money, then as money becomes less or more plentiful, your feelings or your sentiments about mandatory minimum sentences could change with the budget instead of with what is morally right, which is we need to be keeping people out of prison for extraordinary amounts of time for ridiculously low crimes, and we also need to stop disproportionately targeting African Americans, especially African American males in this.
I hear you on that. And you know what my own view on this is? Even the most, hawkish fiscal conservative, at the end of the day, they understand the basic unfairness of this. So that, it may be economic arguments they think that move legislators, that may be the tools of their advocacy to show that it's consistent with their philosophy. At the end of the day, people realize one size fits all doesn't work. It just makes no sense. No two same people are the same. No two crimes are the same. And so much of what we want in this country is to be treated as an individual. And so if an individual makes a mistake, they should be punished as an individual, not as part of a member of a conspiracy, not as a part of a member of a racial group. Whatever it is, we want to know, if you have kids, you punish them for what they do. You don't punish them collectively. And so I think people just get this basic sense of fairness. Now, how they argue it, you're right. Some of it's economic and fiscal, and that may seem like it could turn if suddenly, the budget turned out better. But I do think at root, I'm more optimistic than that. I think people understand that there's a fairness issue involved.
I hope so. I definitely hope so. And I think actually I do agree that I think people see that sometimes. And I get a little bit uneasy in this political environment because I've seen a lot of representatives literally vote against their own interests in the interest of their party or in the interest of what seems to appear to look good for the party instead of what the people actually need or what the people actually want in terms of legislation. I've seen that, and I've seen Trump, sort of be the Pied Piper, if you will, of that sort of, ideology that, hey, it's not about what's actually going on, but what sounds good to address it. It's not about actually addressing the problem, but actually sounding like you're addressing the problem enough that people believe you. And it concerns me that some representatives are willing to put those interests, their own face, so to speak, and their own election chances above the needs of the people. But then again, that's not something that's new in government either.
No, that's right. And, so the answer ultimately is always with the people, and people have to say, stop pandering to me, stop thinking that I want everyone in prison forever. What I want is less crime, and I want fairness in the justice system. And so, instead of being tough on some criminals and beating your chest about that, I want you to lower crime. And the smarter ways to lower crime is not to imprison addicts for 10 years. It's to use all the tools at your disposal. And it's, for some people it is prison. For some people who are dangerous and can't get right, surely incarcerating somebody is the best thing for society. But for other people, there's mental health treatment they need. They need cognitive behavioral therapy. They need drug treatment. So you want to have all those tools at your disposal. And the problem with these long mandatory sentences is you just take all those other tools away.
Yeah, and it's not smart. I mean, I think it's something that we need to look at certainly in these upcoming elections, these off-year elections that we have, and we're electing judges here in Pennsylvania as well. It's another thing to pay attention to, their record on things like this, and former prosecutors who might be serving in the in the House right now that may be pushing for things like this. Also something to pay attention to as well. Kevin Ring, president of Families Against Mandatory Minimums, I appreciate you coming on the show tonight. Do you want to tell folks how they can get in contact with you, or if they want more information, where they can go online for information on your foundation?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. They should come to www.famm.org or follow us on Twitter at FAMM Foundation.
All right, there we go. Kevin Ring, appreciate it as well, president of FAMM, Families Against Mandatory Minimums. We'll talk to you again soon.